one of our favorite actors, Chiwetel Ejiofor, who is one of the stars of the upcoming film, The Life of Chuck. Welcome to AAFCA Roundtables. My name is
Thank
Gil
you.
Robertson, president of the organization, and you have our members here from all over the countries and the Americas, starting with Carolyn Hines in Toronto, Canada, Penny Harper in New York, Jeree in New Jersey, Dana Abercrombie, outside in New York, Nancy Green in LA, Stacey Yvonne, you're in Los Angeles, right? And Philippe Patterson, who is in Washington, DC. I'm going to let you guys do what you do so well. And like I said, there'll be other members who will also be rotating in. They'll introduce themselves, and I'll see you on the other side.
When you look up at the night sky, it can tell you stuff about your future. It won't lie to you. It's pure that way. You might see a lot more than you wanted. But if you have heart, you have hope. And you have heart in you.
The world, Chuck. Everything you've ever loved. Everything you see. Every year that you live, that world will get bigger and brighter. And more detailed and complex. You fill the whole thing. It'll be a universe. Isn't that wonderful?
Hi, sir. How are you? Jeree with the TV Cave.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So the movie's being described as, genre-bending drama with little hints of sci-fi attached to it. With the cinematography and the key art. And you're no stranger to sci-fi. We've seen you in Serenity. We've seen you in the Marvel movies. So what's your favorite aspect of sci-fi, and any of those elements are in this film?
Yeah, I think that the I think it does float through different genres, and so there's a kind of life-affirming apocalyptic tale, if that doesn't sound like an oxymoron, at the center of this. And so the kind of apocalyptic stuff there is a kind of science fiction element to it, I suppose, but it's more, it feels, that this sort of end of the world, there's a kind of sort of naturalism to that, that it plays with. There's a kind of naturalistic drama centered around the world ending, that's part of where the film sort of starts. But in the Stephen King style, I guess, and Mike Flanagan style, it goes into a completely different realm as well. There's a sort of mystery box. And I guess that's the other sort of genre that's in the center of this, is that it's a mystery. And then within that, there are all sorts of other smaller elements, thematic genre elements. There's within the story that I'm exploring in the film, there's a romantic element. This guy is trying to reconnect, I think, with his ex-wife in some way as things are falling apart, and he finds that he sort of needs that moment of reconnection. And so there's this sort of emotional template that happens as well. So it does feel like there's a lot of things kind of happening throughout the story. And And I think it's a credit to not only Stephen King, obviously in the short story, but to Mike Flanagan as well, that that the tonality is so interestingly held, throughout all of that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Penny Harper from Pembroke TV. How are you doing today, sir?
Very good. Thank
Good.
you.
So, The Life of Chuck, from when I watched it, it seemed to connect characters that they're not normally connected, right? And their lives were separate, and there were three acts. In which act do you think you most impacted Chuck so that you became part of this film, this character?
Yeah, well, I feel like it's in what would be, yeah, it's always a bit confusing because there's the third act of the story, which is the first act of the film, but the but I think in the first act, of the story, so the end of the film really is where you kind of get hints of what the sort of dynamic really was, and it starts to kind of give clues to what the overall mystery is that's at the center of the story, and in a way, it's sort of the film centers on how people impact each other's lives, and people can have almost even a low frequency in somebody's life. That is, it maybe not even somebody that you consciously think about that much, but you can have in times of stress, in times of in times which in this case are kind of apocalypse, in times of things ending, um, you might think about those people. They might come back into your consciousness somehow. And I think it sort of is a wonderful way of exploring how we all impact each other in life, and how much information we actually retain about each other through the journey of life. Some of it we don't utilize or don't consciously consider, but it's all there. All of the people that we've ever met are stored somewhere, and maybe at some point some of them will pop back in, and so the film sort of explores those kinds of human connections, in this case within the sort of narrower context of educators, which is also something that I really liked and really responded to. That educators have this outsized impact on people's lives. In this case, in very positive ways, and that's something that I think is very true as well.
Hi, Dana Abercrombie, The Coalition. What I loved about this movie, especially when it came to your chapter, is the fact that there is still love within the X. And so can you talk about kind of those last moments that she would be the character who's completely on your mind?
Yeah, I think that is, that the end of that through this apocalypse, there's this idea of Marty reconnecting with Felicia, his ex-wife, and this need of human contact and human connection. And one of the things that I thought was really rich about the story was that that through the pyrotechnics, there weren't the pyrotechnics of the end of the world, particularly. There weren't the big sort of dramatic moments, It was it's kind of quiet. There's the quiet reflection. It's almost as if all of that has happened, all of the kind of crazy, which I think we've all experienced to a degree through COVID, was that initially there is all of that panic, and there's fear, there's uncertainty, there's deep uncertainty. Nobody knows which way it's going to go, or whether it is the beginning of some snowball effect that's going to be, everybody's having these kind of existential questions. But even with that, you've got to kind of then take on the business of the day. Well, what am I going to do today? It's like Wednesday, and okay, maybe the world's ending, but I've still got to figure out, what to do. And there's there's the mundanity of that, and there's just the kind of the business of getting on with it. And in a sense, that's where we find Marty. It's just sort of in the business of getting on with it. He's at school. He's trying to do a parent-teacher conference thing, and he's trying to sort of figure out how the students are doing, even though everything is kind of falling apart. And it felt very natural that that's ultimately what you'd end up doing. You're not just going to sit at home waiting for the end. You've got to engage somehow. So but through that, obviously there are these kind of deeper conversations that happen with the people that you most connect to, and it's almost like the inverse of what normally happens in everyday life, or certainly in screenwriting as well, the where the conversation that you're having with somebody is quite light in some way. It's sort of talking about, and everything is about the subtext. What is the subtext? What are the deeper resonances of the subtext? And here it's sort of slightly different because they're talking about the big and the great questions of life, and then the subtext is the kind of smaller things of them just wanting to check in on each other and them just wanting to see how each other are, and I sort of love that sort of inversion. All of it felt very truthful to me. Maybe in part of that is to do with the kind of post-pandemic kind of reality for everybody, that we've kind of all experienced some version of these kinds of conversations or some version of these kinds of dynamics. And so I appreciated being able to place that information within a kind of creative space.
Hello, Chiwetel. This is Philippe from Taji Mac. How you doing?
Good, good.
Good, good. So you play Marty, one of the key figures in the first act of the film, in the life of Chuck. So what if we retitle it and said The Life of Chiwetel? What key person from your life would you have star in your first act, and why?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, inevitably I have to say my mother, because because if she ever heard any of this and I didn't say that, then it would be a big problem. So I'd start there. The the sort of, well, she has just had an absolutely outsized impact and continues to, really, on my life and my experience of the world, and I'm deeply grateful for and appreciative of the way that she has kind of been in the front position, in my experiences, which has been amazing. But I think there's something about Marty, like I was saying before, that is really somehow about as well about people that who you don't necessarily think about immediately, that sort of sit behind the consciousness in a way. Inevitably, that makes it kind of harder to think about who that specifically would be. But I would imagine that there would be people. There were certainly some of the educators, some of the teachers that I had, that had a real influence on me, especially the ones that very early on kind of were encouraging, just that there was a kind of the sort of gentle push, the sense of like, no, we think that this is, or I think this is a really good space for you, that this creative space is something that you can do. Or those moments, I think, when you're growing up, when you achieve something, and people, and somebody recognizes it, and it can be sort of small. It can be just that you're, I don't know, some grades in a particular year are just that bit more advanced, that bit better, than they had been at an equivalent point the year before, or whatever it is. And somebody just mentions to you, that your focus is really excellent, or your capacity is really improving, or your kind of way of just something about you is really impressing, and you just sort of walk at that kind of age when you're 13, 14, and for that afternoon or whatever to recess, you're just walking a little bit taller. Those are the sort of moments, I think, that actually end up affecting how you engage, your confidence to engage with the world a little bit. And so I would hope somebody in a context like that, I'd hope that an educator would be part of that story.
Okay. Well, great film, man. I was just looking forward to see you dance. So
maybe next time.
Next time. All right. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy Green here.
Hi.
And hi. And one of the things I was curious about with this movie is it's a very deeply emotional and philosophical kind of film. And so I wanted to know, what did you learn working on it that you feel like is something that's really important for audiences to get? And how did it impact your life personally?
Yeah, I think that there were a few things that I was excited about. I think first of all, in just a creative space, I was really impressed by the way Mike Flanagan put the team together. Just all of the heads of department, all of the crew, just everybody who was working on it were all in the same sort of mental space, if you like. They were just, everybody was very, I think it's because there were quite a few people that he'd worked with before, but also I think that he has this capacity to really communicate what he wants, and also to communicate his own sort of worldview. And he's able to be quite emotional, and emotionally available. And so people felt comfortable being honest and to a degree really relishing the emotional aspects of the story, and the positive and the nurturing and the life affirming aspects of the story. And that was present right from the moment that I turned up to sort of shoot the film. So I arrived into an environment where people were very kind of, they had a very heartfelt enthusiasm for the story and for what was being attempted. And that transferred onto the set. And so people were incredibly supportive. And although in pockets that has happened, it's not sort of unknown to do that. I just felt like it was very curated in this instance. And all of that assisted the telling of the story and the tone of the telling of the story, and it is a story that has kind of, that has big swings, there are things in it that, that are on paper quite risky. The big dance number is quite risky on paper, and but even the sort of the skywriter, it's sort of they can be light, and when they work, they're great. I think they really hit, but on paper, these things can be quite like, oh, really? Is that going to work? Is that going to take an audience out? Is that going to do, is that going to do what we want it to do, basically? And it felt like you have to have a very strong overall sense of what your tone is, and that needs to be very supported by everybody around you in the vicinity of the project, in order to land it, actually. And so that's one of the things that I just felt was, is it something that I learned? I mean, it's something that I felt was very important to understand and to see, basically. And although the audience doesn't necessarily get that information, I think they do subliminally get that information from the film. I think it's a film that is very full of the kind of emotional truth and life-affirming truth and the spirit, essentially, in which it was made.
Nice, thank you so much, and very beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, Chiwetel. Carolyn for Carolyn Talks YouTube and podcast channel. Thank you so much for joining us for this interview today. So something that I had no idea what this film was about going in, so I was completely taken over by how existential it is. And I want you to talk about the idea, the concept of containing multitudes. So saying that that's the phrase that I've used before. I've said I contain multitudes. I like to say sometimes I'm a woman of vast potential, but something that I want you to talk about is containing multitudes as a performer, because what the concept of multitudes in this film is about is like each person that we meet, each environment that we're in, whether it's a school, work, romance, that's the universe that people create within themselves unconsciously in their mind. But as a performer, you contain multitudes with all the characters that you've played, all the universes that you've inhabited on sets and productions. And in talking about multitudes, there's some that stay with you and the universes that stay with you. And as you're going on, like they leave you eventually, like they're worn out. So I want you to talk about containing multitudes as an actor, the personas that you have to take on, and being able to let them go when it's time to let them go, when it's time to say goodbye. And because I think saying goodbye is a big part of this film, like being able to say goodbye. So I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's a great question. I think that I think it's very true that as an actor, you have that very direct link to this concept, to this idea of containing multitudes, and that's one of the great privileges, of being an actor, and it's one of the reasons that I think that I wanted to be an actor, because I wanted to express myself, but I didn't want to necessarily express myself as myself, which it felt a bit creatively naked, I guess, and I didn't, and so very early in my working life, very early in, like, when I stepped on stage, maybe even for one of the first times, and was doing like a Shakespeare play or something with either the youth theatre that I was close to growing up or at my high school. I just immediately felt like I could express things about myself through these other people, through these other characters, and there was a kind of release and a catharsis in that. And it was the reason that I sort of fell in love with being a performer, really, and that also other people could see aspects of themselves through these characters, and so there was a kind of communal catharsis that kind of that can happen in a theater space, and so these sort of and these characters to some degree, because it's impossible, I think, to play a part that isn't in you somewhere. It's very hard to connect to parts that you don't understand. So these characters you do carry them around. They are a part of you, and even though you do try, I think, to put them away, um, I don't know if it really works like that. I feel like you can consciously sort of put them aside. But I think once you've investigated that part of yourself, it's always sort of there. It's always kind of quietly in the corner. And that's sort of what I feel. I feel like I can't, if I look back on the work that I've done, and and I look at a character, or I look at the part that I played, I immediately get a residual feeling of that character. You know what I mean? I immediately feel like I sit back into it just a tiny bit. Even just reading the name of it or the title of the piece, and this can be 20, 25 years, in some cases 30 years later. And so, yeah, I think that there is a kind of, I think it's one of the things that appealed to me about this film was this idea of containing multitudes, and how actors sit very, very fully within that concept.
Yeah, it's fascinating idea concept for me because I never thought of it with regards to the people we meet. I always think of containing multitudes as just like our talents, the things we love, our personal passions. But the film made me really think of like how actors inhabit characters and spaces. But thank you so much for talking with us, and like fantastic film. I love existential films. I love films like that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Chiwetel.
Hi.
Rubén Peralta from Miami. One of the things that I love about the story that Stephen King write and tell is about that we have this huge menace. We have a monster. We have many things that we're facing. But he loves to write about the characters around this situation or this monster. How was that work with Mike Flanagan to create layers on your character? Because I think it's like a pivotal character for Chuck. It's super important. And how was that work to create layers on your characters to support Chuck's story?
Yeah, I thought it was well, again, there's sort of two aspects of that. There's there's Mike as a director, and the specificity that he uses in terms of what he wants to get out of a scene and out of a moment. And then there's Mike as the person, who with casting director is putting together this kind of world, and one of the things that was really exciting for me is finding the layers of this character through other people, you know. Um, so so obviously there's Karen Gillan, brilliant as Felicia, but there are other people in the story as well that Marty is meeting, and they bring out all of these kinds of different shades of him. So one of his neighbors, for example, Matthew Lillard in the film, and Matthew's completely brilliant in the film, absolutely amazing. And it was such a great pleasure to work with him. He brings this kind of to this character. He brings this kind of chaotic energy that feels exactly right for the time, the place, the kind of circumstances, and the sort of neurosis of what's going on, but is completely sort of believable and connected, and that it's heightened but real. And I just, I felt like that brings out something in Marty. And then at almost the other end of the spectrum is another brilliant performance by Carl Lumley, who Marty meets on the road. And he has this depth and spirituality and understanding of all of these different kind of aspects of the human condition. And that then also brings out in Marty this other kind of more philosophical kind of gearing. And so all of the story, kind of the layering of the story, had those kinds of balances, and that's part of obviously the short story, but it was casting, and it's the way that the film is kind of put together. And it allowed me, one of the things I was really excited about was it allowed me to go on a journey and to find these different layers of this character, through other people and then through the circumstances, which I thought were just very richly created, and especially one moment which really struck me in the filming of it, and I have never really forgotten, is the throwing away of of his cell phone, and and it's quite understated in the film. He just sort of drops it and walks away. And it's sort of stayed with me because of my own relationship, to this thing, and
Yeah.
and just knowing how captured I am by it, and how to drop it and walk away would be the equivalent of the stars going out to me, in some way, and that's so crazy, this sort of attachment to technology. So being able to find those kinds of conversations, I suppose, with other people, layering of character, and conversations within myself through this text was a really fascinating journey.
It's a very beautiful film. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Chiwetel. My name is Stacey Vaughn. I really enjoyed your performance in this film, and one thing I noticed is I was asking about the room that has a lock on it, and we find out later in the film kind of the significance of the lock. I want to know kind of what the significance was for you, because later the look at the room is more, trepidatious, there's more curiosity, but Marty's look almost had a look of regret. And so what were you thinking about that was behind the door?
Yeah. Great. Yeah, no, that's really great. Beautifully spotted the of that moment, I think that for me in that moment, it's all of, because I do think that Marty does represent, even though he represents this kind of part of the wider psychology of everything that's going on, I do think each person within that psychology has tapped into a lot of information, just a lot of information that maybe they don't actively know, but it felt to me like it was all of the nature of spirituality, the nature of this kind of higher concept idea of how we're all connected, and there is this kind of, in this story, that there is this sort of the germ of this idea of that's really a kind of an Eastern spiritual concept of the fact that we're all connected as part of, from plants to other people to all of us together, that we're all just parts of another giant being, basically, that we're all just part of a living organism, a connected living organism. But each one of us, however small in the sort of chain of those things, has an incredible amount of information that maybe we don't access all the time. But when confronted with certain things, and definitely when confronted with stress or high levels of a certain thing, we can access, some of those things. And that's sort of, to me, the kind of basis of real spiritual thought, and that some people can find ways not in stress, but in relaxation, in terms of real connection, in religion, in understanding the higher power around them, of accessing those things. And so in that moment, I felt that Marty is a cog in everything, but also has all of the information, but not that he necessarily knows he has it.
Right.
I think that was the key. But it's all there. So when he sees it, he knows sort of what it is and what it represents to a degree. And if he were to open it, it would explain all of the things that he thinks he's going through. But he won't open it for exactly that reason,
Yeah.
So, and I felt like that's very human to me. That's very human in our connection to religion, in our connection to understanding the higher power, and so on. So it was a really interesting beat to consider for me. So I'm glad.
Yes, very beautifully said. And I am really happy to have you now in the Flanagan verse. I really hope you two get to work together again.
Yeah, so do I. So do I, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Michael Sowell from Sowell Media. How are you doing?
Very good.
First, congratulations with this film. I love, even though it was a short time in the first third of this film, I feel that scene with you and Karen was just beautiful. You sitting on a bench and looking at the stars, and going back to the scene previously where you're seeing with Matthew talking about, the stages of grief, and the last stage is acceptance. So, and with all the chaos going on in the world, people, internet's losing, and people don't know what's going on. When you come to that point of acceptance, and I want to make this personal, if it is in a moment where you're in your final moments in a grandized moment, and is happening, what would you do, and who would you be with?
In the final, and when the final curtain's coming down.
Exactly, the final curtain call.
Exactly. Well, inevitably, being sentimental, I would be with my family. I would be that's I would endeavor to be there, and I feel like it's that sense of. I think that's what Marty is really looking for, is that sense of connection, and but that's what's meaningful, and I think that he would feel, and I would feel very grateful within that context to have that sense of connection. In the early days of COVID, I was actually separated from most people that I knew, and I was in New York because I was working in New York when it all kind of kicked off, and so most of the people that I am very connected to are either in London or here in Los Angeles, and so there was a real sense of isolation. And if things kind of really got out of hand, one of the things that would be really regretful was just not having. And one of the things I felt, a lot of people felt isolated, but one of the things that I really felt was that disconnect. That it felt very unnatural within that kind of context, within that sort of chaos, to not have that feeling of going through it with people that you really bonded with, that really meant a lot to you. So I feel like for Marty, there's a real sense of gratitude, and I think that comes with acceptance. That you can be angry and all of those things, and you can be confused about it all, but at a certain point, if you have that moment of acceptance, then the next thing you're going to have is probably gratitude. Gratitude for all of the things that you got to see and experience, and the life you were able to live, and the people that you were able to love and to connect to, is and so we all hope that we can carry those sort of meaningful understandings throughout our life, and to live in a life of gratitude and acceptance and so on. It's harder in the day to day, and it sort of requires those kind of big moments, or when you're reflecting on it, to think and feel those things. But that would be my hope for the final curtain.
I just want to say that this was a beautiful film. Thank you for your performance.
Thank you.
Hey, how you doing, sir? This is Samuel Leggett with JVS Media Productions. I had the opportunity of checking out this film at TIFF last year, and it was one of my favorite films to watch. So thank you for talking with us. I gotta keep harping on mortality. The conversation you have with Carl's character, Sam, Matthew's character, Gus, and of course, Karen's character, Felicia, it breaks down the different levels of mortality, and the acceptance, true, but how people on a human level perceive it, and how they take and pull different levels of what is true about their values for it. I want to kind of break that down for you in the sense of I mean, we did just go through a pandemic. There was a point in the pandemic, there was no vaccine. We didn't know if there was a way out. There was an impending level of hesitation of where we're going to come out on the other side of it. And all of us had to deal with that level of mortality. But with this film specifically, did you feel like there were different parts of that helped you unpack things that you didn't even think about then when we were going through the pandemic? Did it any level of catharsis for you going through this film from your character Marty as well?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I do think that the pandemic was a very good, if I was a method actor, do you know what I mean? Like, I would, in preparation for this film, I would go through the pandemic. It was very fertile in the sense of like the themes that that we were all kind of confronted with, and the trauma of that, really. I feel like collectively we haven't necessarily all kind of figured out how to talk about it, But my expectation was actually coming out of the pandemic that would be everything. The whole of media would be flooded with recollections and stories and feelings and all of the things that it brought up, and it sort of didn't happen, So there was a sort of we've sort of all agreed not to kind of talk about it in a weird way, and I'm not quite sure why that is, seeing as everybody went through it and everybody had all of these kind of emotions and these responses, but so in a way it was like I say, it was good for me in a way to be able to express some of those feelings creatively, because they are there, and I knew that anybody watching it would understand all of those sort of nuances, in a way that they wouldn't in 2019. You know what I mean? Like the film wouldn't, would be confusing in a sense in 2019, whereas now everybody watching it sort of gets what it's talking to. So yeah, I feel like that was the sort of sense of that was the kind of connective tissue for me, that was um, and I suppose to your question, whether beyond that, I do think that there were other things that I was learning and picking up on. Like I say, the reliance on technology was a major part of it. The sort of absence of explicit spirituality, was something that I also felt was that, again, it felt that there was something that it remains unsaid, and and I think that's for me as well, that it was that the spiritual conversation is to some degree subtextual, but I say it's subtextual, but it's omnipresent and subtextual. It's sort of everywhere and kind of buried, and I think that was something that was very intriguing for me as well, because I actually also think that that's quite natural, that you would start off with this strong belief that everything would be about preparing yourself spiritually, but then actually it would sit behind, much like it did in the pandemic. Actually, it just sort of ended up sitting behind everything and becomes just a part of the way that you're relating to the world, which I thought was very interesting.
No, I think that was perfectly said. I mean, the character of Marty has got literal like layers and then metaphorical layers, but the film itself unpacks so much more. So thank you so much. This is a great film. Thank you for talking with us.
Thank you, Samuel.
Chiwetel, thank you so much for your time today. We love this film. We love everything that you do. So just keep doing what you're doing, and we certainly will be here to support. On behalf of the world's largest group of Black film and TV critics, thank you for watching this edition of AAFCA Roundtables. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.